Welcome to my Career Book Club, where we explore real strategies for thriving in your career. My name is Julie Cullen, and in this podcast I get to indulge in two of my favourite pastimes. The first is reading books, and the second is sharing what I've learned. Each week I provide key learning points from some of my favourite career and personal development books and share them in the context of real, lived experiences combined with practical coaching tips to help you apply what you've learned. A couple of things before we get into today's episode. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for tuning in to the podcast every week. It means the world to me as you're helping me to achieve a dream of mine, so thank you for that. And secondly, if you enjoy these episodes, please hit the subscribe button and follow us on whichever app you're currently listening. It helps to build the visibility of this podcast on the platforms. I also invite you to get in touch with me if there are any books that you would like to hear featured on this podcast. Now, I love a good recommendation, so just comment below or DM me on LinkedIn with your recommended reading so that I can deliver the content that you want to listen to. Thank you, and now into today's episode. If you've been regularly listening to this podcast, you'll know that for the last 3 episodes we have been talking about various different habits from the book How Women Rise by Sally Helgesen and Marshall Goldsmith. These are habits or behaviours that they've identified that can sometimes hold you back in your career. And each week we've grouped them into different topics. Week 1, episode 1 was visibility. Episode 2 was all about building relationships. Episode 3 was all about putting your job before your career. In this final episode on the book How Women Rise, we're talking about mindset habits that can quietly derail even the most talented leaders. So these are habits that you may not have previously thought about. I know I certainly hadn't. But they are very interesting to reflect on and consider how they impact on your career. And there were 3 habits in particular in the book that I grouped into this category. The first was being too much, and that was habit number 10. The second habit was ruminating, habit number 11. And the third was letting your radar distract you, which was habit number 12. From the title, I wasn't really entirely sure what it was about, but once you dig into it, you will get to recognise it. And you'll hear a little bit more about that one also in this podcast. So what I'm going to do throughout the podcast is share some of the stories from the book that help to illustrate what these habits actually mean and how they can sabotage your career. Let's start with something many women may have heard in the workplace. When someone says to you, "You're too much." What do they mean by that? Too emotional? Too talkative? Too revealing? And the message that you get back from somebody saying that to you is, tone it down. And Sally calls this the too much, not enough double bind. Too much passion? You're unstable. Too little passion? You're cold. Too much enthusiasm? You're naive. Too little, you're disengaged. It can feel exhausting if you've ever heard the phrase, too much. So let's start with too much emotion. Now, while Sally and Marshall focused this book in on how women behave in the workplace, Marshall in particular had done a lot of work with male clients. And what he noticed was that for his male clients, anger is the emotion that's most likely to get in the way of their career success. While with women, they're more likely to display strong emotions in the form of anxiety, resentment, or fear. And what's important is that the emotion that you feel is not the problem. In fact, emotions give you that useful feedback about the situation you're in. However, speaking up while in the grip of emotion can be a big problem. And some of the examples cited in the book were about your perceptions and how they can be distorted about who's to blame, who's at fault. You can find yourself maybe overstating your case, or maybe coming across as touchy or out of control. The book touches on how women are often penalised at work for displaying strong emotions, with feedback like, oh, you're too sensitive, you overreact. This creates this double blind that she talked about. If you show emotion, you risk being seen as unstable or unprofessional, but if you withhold it, then you can be seen as being cold or disengaged. There's a balance to be found there. And there's an interesting story that was used in the book about a woman called Rosa, an executive in a company who was once nicknamed the Volcanic Latina for her passionate reactions. And so over time, what Rosa had learned to do was to temper rather than suppress her feelings. So when she could feel that concern rising up within her, she would listen to it and use that to understand what was going on, what was happening, what was her thoughts, what was her concerns over maybe the risk of a particular project they were working on. And so what she did is she learned to listen to the emotional feeling that she was experiencing. But instead of communicating that in an emotional state, she would take the time and space to consider the source of the emotion, and then, once she was calmer, deliver her message. And she was able to do it in a much more powerful, confident, measured, and authentic manner. And in doing that, she transformed her intensity from a liability into a respected leadership trait. Because when you feel that emotion, that can be so powerful if you then use that to express what you want to say with intention. So it's about using your emotions more effectively rather than just reacting to them in the moment. The key lesson is that emotions in themselves are not the problem. It's how they're managed and expressed that determines their impact. So leaders who can acknowledge strong feelings without being consumed by them are able to then project both authenticity and authority. So in the book, what Sally encourages women to do is not to mute yourself. That's not what we're saying here. And that's certainly not what Rosa did. What she's encouraging us to do in the book is to just pause for a moment, centre yourself, and then communicate your emotions in a way that strengthens the credibility rather than undermining it. This shift will allow your emotions to become a source of influence and connection rather than a career liability. And that goes for anybody listening out there, female, male. If you have an emotional reaction to anything, regardless of what type of emotion that is, it can be a liability if you don't learn to rein it in and listen to it rather than articulating it in the heat of the moment. Another too much that was mentioned in the book is too many words. So what the book highlighted was that quite often women can dilute their impact by over-explaining, repeating themselves, or padding statements with unnecessary detail. And when I was reading the typical objections regarding this wordy communication, I could relate to it, because I've worked with people and there started popping into my mind these people that would use 100 words when 10 would have been enough. I'm sure you know a few as well. And so some of the objections that were listed in the book was things like people taking too much time getting to the point, people prefacing a suggestion with a lot of background information first. And that's an interesting one because actually I did do a workshop on this, and I have a workbook I'm going to share with you. You'll find a link to it in the show notes, which gives you a framework for simplifying the way you express yourself so you get to the point quickly, rather than giving a lot of detail first before you can get to the point, and you end up losing people. So I'll share that with you in the show notes for this podcast episode. And that actually falls neatly into over-explaining, so the framework kind of helps with that as well. Another objection was offering multiple rationales and examples, or volunteering explanations instead of waiting to be asked. So there was a lot of objections cited about people getting frustrated when you take too long to explain something and you don't just get to the point. And in actual fact, that's the name of the workbook that I'm going to share. It's all about getting to the point. Because in the corporate world, attention spans can be punishingly short. And I think we're getting so used to having information at us so quickly and in our hands in such a short period of time that we expect people to just get to the bottom line. Especially at senior levels. I've seen this before when I used to work in corporate, when either executives have complained to me about people who didn't get to the point, or people have come to me for coaching because they feel that they weren't able to get to the point. So it is quite important, especially as you move up the career ladder, to be able to communicate in a very succinct manner. And there was a story in the book about Sherry, who was in medicine. And in that world, you kind of have to get to the point. You know, doctors do not have a lot of time. And sometimes they have to deliver some very important information in a very short period of time, in what can be quite an emotional situation. So for a doctor, it's very important then to learn to focus on what's essential and get to the point. And I don't know if you've ever been in a hospital environment where you notice the consultants, it almost feels like they have no emotions, they just cut to the chase. But that's because they have to. That's what they've learned to do. Cut out the emotion, get to the point. And so Sherry's feeling was that experience that she had in the medical world proved to be great preparation when she moved into the corporate world. And she started to observe that a lot of colleagues, particularly male colleagues, would comment on how quickly she got to the point as if it was something unusual, until she started to notice how impatient these same executives would become with people, particularly women, who were less concise. So the lesson from here is that brevity equals power. Over-explaining can signal insecurity, while clear and streamlined communication gives you that air of confidence and strategic thinking. And then the final too much that was mentioned in the book is too much disclosure. So there's this feeling that in the workplace, women can tend to overshare personal details or vulnerabilities. And it was interesting because she noticed that while disclosure can strengthen bonds in friendships, in a professional context, it can backfire. And so, again, it can cause colleagues to question your credibility or your emotional steadiness. You know, for instance, I don't know about you, but a lot of women I meet find it quite easily to talk openly about their insecurities or their personal struggles or some self-doubt that they might have. Not everybody is comfortable with that, and so it can undermine you from a professional standing. To be authentic doesn't mean you have to share everything you feel. Effective leaders practice strategic self-disclosure. So, sharing personal stories or challenges when they serve a purpose, such as building trust or inspiring the team, humanising themselves. The goal is to be real, but be practical enough not to reveal too much. Don't overshare in a way that might erode respect. Okay, it's about keeping a balance that keeps your credibility intact while still honouring the value of openness. So to sum up, if you relate to any of these too much scenarios, you now understand the impact and whether or not you feel you need to take action. So if too much emotion is your thing, take a leaf out of Rose's book and learn to stay quiet in the emotion. Take a moment to understand the cause of the emotion and then plan how to deal with or articulate it in a calm, considered manner. If you use too many words, start to edit yourself. Reread emails for how much unnecessary content can be removed. No, this isn't just about verbal communication, it's also about written communication. Plan what you want to say and how you want to say it. And as I mentioned earlier, you can download my Get to the Point framework. It's in the show notes that will help you in that preparation. And then if you do disclose too much, find a balance between what to share and who to share it with. Not all workplace relationships are equal. Now let's talk about a mental habit that robs women of peace and progress, and that is rumination. And you'll not believe how many times I had to re-record that word. I can never pronounce that word. Rumination. And all it means is the tendency to chew endlessly on mistakes, slights, regrets, instead of letting it go. And I'm sure there are a lot of you out there listening to this right now who recognise that, who do that a lot. And I'll put my hand up alongside you and say, so do I. How often do you replay the moment? A presentation, a conversation, a document submission with questions like, oh, why did I say that? What must they think of me? How could I have done it differently? It's mental quicksand. And once you're in it, you just don't seem to be able to get out of it. It's like this downward spiral of self-criticism. And as explained in the book, rumination is counterproductive for two reasons. It's always going to make you feel worse. And it gets in the way of your ability to resolve your problems. In the book, there's a story about Lisa, a film producer. Now, she went from being her CEO's right-hand woman to feeling sidelined after a flashy new hire arrived, as it was described. All of a sudden, her projects were given less focus and attention. They were considered to be the bread and butter for the company, while the huge budgets were plunged into bigger, more glamorous projects with the new guy. Instead of confronting the situation, she just spiralled inwards, agonising over what she'd done wrong. Was it her films, her wardrobe, her relationship with his ex-wife? She ruminated to the point of paralysis. And interestingly enough, her breakthrough came from a conversation with the ex-wife over a coffee, where the ex-wife told her that this isn't about you. It's about him trying to reinvent his life. She said to her, stop replaying it, start deciding what you'll do next. And that was the wake-up call that freed Lisa. That's what she needed to hear. And she did eventually leave the company, not in any bitterness, but with gratitude for what she'd gained. But she was ready to move forward and do what was right for her. The problem was never ever about her, but she ruminated to the point of paralysis until that conversation. So my question to you is, do you go into analysis paralysis after every meeting or conversation? You know, does your boss's seeming lack of interest in you send you into self-judgment spiral? It's common. I know we all do it. I call it the post-match analysis, right? We do it every time we have a conversation, every time we do a presentation, every time we share a piece of work. And so one strategy I share with my clients to stop this rumination, which I mentioned, is called the post-match analysis. After every meeting, after every conversation, after every project, ask yourself the following 2 questions. What went well? How could it have been even better? There will always be things that you're pleased with, and there's always opportunity for improvement. But notice there are no recriminations on those questions. No questioning about what went wrong. That's not productive or helpful. So if you find yourself going into that loop of, why did I say that? What must they think of me? Just stop. Break the cycle and change your focus by asking those two questions. What went well? How could it have been even better? And finally, habit number 12 in the book was called letting your radar distract you. Interesting enough, when I started reading about this in the book, I started to understand what they meant by that. And one of the things they highlight is that radar is a very powerful, strong female or feminine behaviour, strength even. It's the ability to notice a lot at once. But radar has a dark side as well, and that's distraction. And oh my word, do I relate to that. The simplest of things can distract me. And what the book is saying basically is that too much scanning can scatter your focus, which actually can then start feeding your self-doubt and anxiety. And there was a story in the book about Taylor, who was an executive coach. So her active radar helped her to have deeper insight into her clients' needs. But in larger groups, she found it really difficult because there's so much going on and so many different actions, or reactions rather, to read. And that made it difficult for her to focus on what she was trying to do. And there's a story shared in the book about how she was delivering this presentation. There was about 50 potential new clients in the room. And at first she was confident and she was going through her presentation. And then one man caught her eye in the front row, and he seemed a bit irritated and sceptical. And she became fixated on him. Started thinking, what was wrong? What could she do about it? Then a woman in another part of the room interrupted with a complaint about the session's topic. And there's a whole lot of detail in the book, but Taylor spiralled, right? All these distractions started to spiral at her. She lost her focus. She rushed through her presentation. She felt like a failure. Now later on, when she was chatting about this with a colleague, they gave her a different perspective and said, well, that guy, what about him? You don't know what was wrong with him. He could have had a fight with his wife. Might not have been about you. He might have been thinking about how he was going to deal with this when he got home. And it was pointed out to Taylor that her job wasn't to fix the problem. It was to serve the room. And Taylor realised that she had been too busy trying to read her audience and figure out if she was fulfilling expectations, that she lost sight of her presentation content and even her purpose for giving the talk. Rather than focusing what was in her control, rather than focusing on giving the room a positive experience, she started focusing on the problems of these individuals. So what about you? Do you have a radar? Does your radar help you or hijack you? Do you interpret every frown as criticism? What stories are you telling yourself about other people's reaction? We think we're mind readers. A look, a movement by one individual can immediately send us spiraling into thinking something, they're thinking something bad about us. We think we're mind readers. We're not. Your radar is a gift, but like any gift, it needs discipline. So if you find yourself in that situation, try a quick reframe. That look might have nothing to do with me. In fact, that look probably has nothing to do with you. And even if that look does have something to do with you, there's not really a lot you can do about it in that moment, in that situation. Don't allow it to distract you. Ground yourself in purpose. What am I here to deliver? Focus on that. Focus on the wider audience. Focus on how you want the room to feel, not just that one individual who happens to have distracted you. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. From today's episode, we've learned too much. Too much temper, emotion, wordiness and disclosure. I'm not saying you have to mute yourself, but channel your voice with clarity, calmness, decisiveness. Then we talked about rumination. Stop chewing on old mistakes. Right? Interrupt the loop. Move forward. That's probably one of the toughest ones I know for a lot of people. You really need to turn off that soundtrack that's playing in your mind. Think of those two questions. What went well, even better with. That's it. Move forward. And then finally, radar. Use your awareness wisely. Don't let it scatter your focus. Don't let it distract you. This advice is not about becoming someone else. It's not about changing who you are. It's about refining how you show up so that your strengths shine and these behaviours don't sabotage your career. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Career Book Club. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with a friend or colleague who you think needs to hear this. In the next episode, we are moving on to a brand new book. It's by the very well-known Mel Robbins, and the book is called The Let Them Theory. You may have heard it recently. So we're going to take a look at the content of the Let Them Theory and how you can apply that to your career. Make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to this podcast, to follow me for more real strategies to help create a career you love. And remember, if you have a book recommendation that you'd like to be featured on this podcast, please get in touch. My details will be in the show notes. Bye for now.